It's a very difficult gospel to read when you have a 500 Polaris Ranger sitting out in the narthex and you're selling raffle tickets for it. Jesus today is chasing the money changers and all of the people selling sheep and oxen out of the temple. He had a good reason for doing it. The temple was constructed for the purpose of worshiping God. The money changers, the tax, and the people selling sheep and oxen were compromised by their own self-interest. They weren't doing it for God. We're selling the Polaris for God, just so you know. It's for the parish. The temple was built for God, but they had used it for their own purposes. For example, under Jewish law, you must sacrifice every year a lamb without blemish at the temple. Or if you couldn't afford a lamb, you needed to purchase 2 turtle doves. And so in order for an unblemished lamb to be unblemished, it had to be certified by a priest that it was indeed unblemished. And so people would take a lamb to the priest, and it would be unblemished, but the priest could just say, no, there's a blemish there, see? Oh, well, we have certified unblemished lambs for sale out in the courtyard, so you can go buy one from them. So the lamb that they had purchased would be useless, and they would be forced to buy a lamb at an increased fee in order to sacrifice what they wanted to come to sacrifice. And if you didn't have the right type of money to use in the temple, you needed to exchange it. In order to exchange the money in the temple, you had to go to people who changed money. The money changers had weighted scales. So you never received the exact amount that you wanted to trade with. You were always being ripped off, and they were taking their percentage. Jesus, on seeing this, of course, comes into the temple, and he's angry. Now, people sometimes paint Jesus with this picture of this nice guy who would never hurt anyone. And very oftentimes I see, on the other hand, people will use this as a source to get angry and impatient with people and do destructive things. But what Jesus is doing here is actually very charitable. It's out of love that he reminds them that you have forgotten what this house is for. This is not about you, this is about God. Several years ago, I was visiting a family when I was in Manitowoc, and they had 2 girls. One was 2.5, and one was just under 1. The older one's name was Gianna, the younger one was Felicity. And Gianna, after her mother had just baked some brownies, was very tempted to take one of those brownies, and as their parents went up to put little Felicity in bed, they told her in no uncertain terms, you're not to take any of these brownies, you have to ask first. And so they went up to put Felicity to bed, and Gianna got the best, temptation got the best of her, and she grabs a brownie. She walks upstairs nonchalantly, eating the brownie in front of her parents. And her mom said, Gianna, remember that you're supposed to ask Mom and Dad to have a brownie? Do you remember that you're supposed to ask to have a brownie? And she said, I know. I asked myself, and I said yes. Well, they thought, of course, at first that it was funny. But on the other hand, they realized something. You have to have something outside of yourself to govern your behavior. There has to be something objective that governs what is right and what is wrong. What I mean by that is something outside of ourselves. Gianna can't judge for herself whether she can have a brownie. The intent of her parents was that she asked somebody outside whether or not she could have that brownie, because her brownie intake at 2.5 years old needs to be regulated. Otherwise, who knows what would happen. At the end of our gospel today, Jesus, or John the gospel writer, tells us that Jesus does not need anyone to testify about human nature because he himself knows it well. What is the gospel passage saying? The Lord knows how easy it is for human beings to turn in on themselves and live their lives only in reference to what they decide is good and bad. The Lord consistently comes into chaos giving us guidelines and rules in order to straighten out and make disorder into order. The other week, we had the Spiritus team here, and they wanted to play this out an example. We literally played a basketball game. It was 3-on-3. I, Luke Eatman, another staff member, were playing 3 of the Spiritus members. The difference is that they told us we don't have to play by the rules of basketball. They didn't tell the teenagers that. So we went out to play, but we were fouling. We were doing things that you can't do in basketball, traveling, blocking shots. We actually won the game 16-0 because what they didn't realize is that I had established one of their players was actually scoring for us. And so they had scored 16 points and we hadn't had any, but I established that we won because that's just the way I decided. But what chaos that creates. Our first reading comes from the time of the desert wanderings when the people had built a molten calf. Do you remember that? They built an oxen out of a molten calf out of the gold they had and began to worship it. There was chaos. And so God introduces the 10 Commandments to give them guidance in that chaos, to reorder their lives toward Him. The same thing of Jesus coming in the temple. The temple worship got disordered. They were turned in on themselves and decided to worship themselves and the god of money rather than worshiping the God for whom the temple was built. That's objective reality. And our culture has kind of lost it. And if you wonder what the world is in chaos for, it's simply because of that. And every one of us has to watch out for it, seeking the self-interest rather the interest of the common good. That's why rules, even though they seem like a burden at first, are actually good for us. The same way they would have been for a 2.5-year-old Gianna. You see, friends, it's not enough to say that we love God in our mind. It's not enough to say that. We have to actually prove it. We have to do it. If you love me, says the Lord, follow my commandments, He says. But who of us, at some point in our lives, could have experienced something of the effects of adultery and felt somehow that life was better after that than it was before? If somebody does, I kind of wonder why. I don't know anyone that hasn't been affected by divorce at this point in our age. And although I understand that some circumstances may warrant it, I don't know anyone that feels like it's a good thing. And so the Lord gives us those commandments. Honor thy father and mother. I don't know anyone who doesn't think it's a good idea that parents should be honored and respected as authority in the house. But yet how little of it do we have nowadays? Is stealing okay? Is killing okay? Gossiping, damaging people's reputations? Friends, all of that stuff leads to chaos. But following the loving commandments of God leads to order and happiness. So today, friends, we ask ourselves, and I just want to finish with this quote that I heard many years ago from Bishop Sheen. He said very simply, if you don't live what you believe, you simply end up believing what you live, and the world ends in chaos. But the reordering can happen today, and we can start now by asking the Lord to help reorder our lives, make a great confession, and begin a new life again.